participants. Thank you to Bobby Westmoreland and Danielle Stout at PAA for setting us up today and for coordinating the advertising and technical organization of today's webinar. Today is volume 2 of this series, the first of which was held in December and was very well received. We plan on hosting volume 3 of the series late this calendar year, so please stay tuned for that. Again, welcome and thank you for spending part of your Friday with us. On a day in which we're celebrating the achievements and continued accomplishments of 3 of our past presidents, and before turning over the webinar to Chairperson of the PAA History Committee, John Weeks, I did want to take a minute to express PAA's sadness and deepest sympathies regarding the very recent loss of 2 of our past presidents. Rob Mayer, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at UCLA, elected member of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and world-renowned expert on social stratification, intergenerational processes, and demographic methods, passed away on February 1st. Rob was PAA's 73rd president, leading the association in 2010. Beyond his scholarly achievements, Rob made many leadership contributions in population studies over the years, just one of which was serving as the founding director of the California Center for Population Research at UCLA. Rob is dearly missed by everyone who knew him. His energy, his passion for demography, and contributions to the field will continue to live on in the work of our association's members. Second, Al Herman, Professor Emeritus of the Population Studies Center and Department of Sociology at the University of Michigan, and a giant of a scholar of fertility, family planning, and the demography of aging, passed away earlier this week on March 2nd. Al was PAA's 46th president, leading the association in 1993. Likewise, Al is a dearly missed member of our community who made research contributions both domestically and internationally across many decades. Al was also instrumental in building the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan. As just one indication of his impact, Al won PAA's inaugural Robert J. Lapham Award in 1989 in recognition of his many contributions to the discipline. Al's legacy will also be echoed throughout our community for generations to come. On behalf of the Population Association of America, I expressed our deepest sympathies for their losses. Thank you. I now turn the program over to Dr. John Weeks, Chair of PAA's History Committee. John has been the energy, the organizer, and the glue of this series, and the PAA is very thankful for the time he has put into organizing today's event. His great communication skills has been instrumental in setting this up. He keeps us all in line and all organized, and it's really wonderful to have his energy in doing that. And it's been his idea for hosting the set of presidential sessions in the first place. So thank you, John. And now I turn over the program to you.
Okay, Bob, thank you very, very much for that introduction. And I appreciate the kind words you had for me, but I need to point out that I am very, very fortunate to have a fantastic history committee. Let me introduce them in terms of seniority. We have Dennis Hodgson, Karen Hardy, Emily Merchant, and Wynn Brown. And I want to mention that the last 2 are going to be working with our PAA Vice President, Marcy Carlson, to organize any questions that those of you watching may have as the panel proceeds. And you are invited to put those onto the Q&A of the Zoom session. And Marcy, Emily, and Wynn will go through those, get them all organized, and at the end of the panel session, then we'll have time to go to those questions for answers by the panelists. So let's get down to business here with the first of our 3 past PAA presidents who are going to be talking about their presidential address and where it's gone since they gave it. Our first presenter is Dr. Reynolds Farley, who is research scientist and a Dudley Duncan Professor Emeritus at the Michigan Population Studies Center and the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. He was PAA president in 1988, at which time he was already at the University of Michigan, where he has been since 1967. So Ren, take it away.
Thank you very much. Bobby, can I go ahead with screen sharing? I think I can.
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. All right, so let me see if I can do this correctly. Slideshow from the beginning, and I should be sharing the screen now. Is that correct? Okay, thank you very much. I was fortunate to serve as president 33 years ago, and I, of course, worried about what I was going to speak about since the PAA has this history of everybody at the meeting attending the presidential address. And that group that I spoke to in 1988 certainly was the most erudite and largest audience that I've ever addressed. That's a picture taken sometime after 1988 of your current speaker. For civil rights in the United States, the 1960s were the most important years since the Reconstruction. Congress, prodded by very active social movements of minorities and women, enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. President Johnson, in his commencement address at Howard University in 1965, focused upon issues of racial equity. And let me quote a bit from President Johnson. He stated, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you have been completely fair. You're now able to compete with all the others." We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. And as a result of that, thinking about my presidential address, I entitled it, "After the Starting Line, Blacks and Women in an Uphill Race." I argued that the Civil Rights Revolution in the 1960s focused about three primary topics. One was equal labor market opportunities and educational opportunities for racial minorities and women. Second, prohibiting policies and laws that maintain social and physical distance between the races. And third, changes overturning the many laws and practices that discriminated with regard to the voting rights of minorities. So I'm going to review some of those trends since then, briefly, using standard measures that are well understood and commonly used to assess the relative economic status, for instance, of men and women, blacks and whites. Let me begin. My data come from the Current Population Survey, the Census, and the American Community Survey. I have in Figure 1 information about the median income of households, black and white households, and in all of my figures, I'm using constant 2019 dollars, so I won't mention that. I've tried to be consistent with a black trend line for African Americans, a blue trend line for whites, and a red trend line showing blacks as a percent of whites. And there is both discouraging and favorable news in a chart such as this one. The median household income of African American families has gone up by 39%. That's good news, but the median income of white households has gone up by 35%. So there's been very little convergence. If this trend were to continue for another century, African American median household income wouldn't be much more than 80 or 82% that of whites. So improvements in economic status, but large racial gaps remaining. Similarly, in Figure 2, I show per capita income, and the years since World War II have been very good ones for America in terms of what they can purchase. Income in constant dollars has been rising quite substantially. Indeed, since the 50-year period since 1970, the income of whites has just about doubled on a per capita basis. The income of African Americans has gone up by about 250%, but that leaves a large racial gap. There certainly is some improvement, and black per capita income has moved a bit closer to that of whites, but it's a very slow pace of change. Let me go into my third figure here, which is the information about the people below the poverty line. In his first presidential address, President Johnson declared a war on poverty, and many programs were adopted, particularly in the Johnson and the Nixon and Ford administrations, to alleviate poverty. And there is some evidence of progress. African American poverty rates were at their lowest level ever in 2019. And yet, there is a large difference. If you look at these poverty rates back in 1975, when these data became readily available on a comparable basis, African American poverty rate was about 3.5 times that of whites, and it's now 2.5 times that of whites. So there's the improvement, but a very slow pace of improvement, and decades and decades and decades would be required to bring the convergence in poverty rates that President Johnson spoke about back in 1965. Let me go on to the next figure. Most people get most of their income from earnings. And here we switch from comparing blacks and whites to comparing men and women. And with regard to earnings, there are very favorable signs of a convergence in the earnings of women and men in this country. And yet women today are not earning as much. And here I use a dashed line to show the earnings of women. Women still today have earnings inferior to those of what men had. But since 1970, male mean earnings for people 25 to 59 who report earnings, they're up only a little bit, where the earnings of women are up much more substantially. And the most recent ACS data suggests that for this adult age group, women are earning about 78% as much as men are, a substantial improvement from what the situation was 50 years ago. In figure 5, I go back to the situation with comparing black men and black and white men on the left-hand side, black and white women on the right-hand side. And again, you see some improvements in earnings for both black and white men, modest though they are, but you see absolutely no convergence if you take as your indicator of convergence black earnings as a proportion of those of white men. There's a little more change among women, and black women and white women have both seen their earnings rise much more rapidly than among men, but there still, again, is a large and persistent racial gap, as there is with almost all indicators comparing blacks and whites. Improvements in the basic status, whether it's income or poverty, but very little in the line of convergence. Rising tides have benefited both races, but the gap is not narrowing very rapidly on these kinds of indicators. Earnings come from occupations usually. What about occupations? Are we seeing any tendency for men and women, blacks and whites, to be working at the same occupations? There was a great deal of controversy about including sex as a basis for discrimination in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, but some very persistent women in Congress got a prohibition against discrimination in the labor market against women. And if you look at the occupational, want to make comparisons over time, you face a challenge because occupations change. We have a lot of information technology occupations that didn't exist in the past, and some old occupations disappear. Steve Ruggles and his group have got a couple of different series of indicators in which they have tried to categorize occupations, and I've used one of his series to show differences by, this is an occupational category. A category includes about 350 occupations, and I use the index of dissimilarity. And in the left-hand panel, you see the index comparing the occupational distribution of men and women. It's quite substantial, but is gradually declining. And if you look at the details, you find that there are still some occupations like elementary school teaching and nursing that men have not entered in very large numbers, and other occupations such as the skilled trades and truck driving that women have not entered. Now, Now, if you recall the things that were written about the history of urban African Americans as long ago as 125 years or so, Du Bois was writing about the Black community of Philadelphia, a largely African-American community surrounded by a white city. But that African-American community had the same array of occupations you'd find in the white community: doctors, lawyers, real estate brokers, and so forth. So it's no surprise that Blacks and whites are more similar in their occupations than are men and women, but the occupational distributions of Blacks and whites have moved somewhat closer together. The occupations that have distinctively few African Americans in them are the skilled trades, despite President Nixon's Philadelphia plan that was designed to put an end to that. So those are my comments about occupation. Briefly, education. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was amended in 1972 to prohibit any sex discrimination in any program, educational program supported with federal dollars. And these charts pertain to people 25 to 29, those who've completed their high school education, college education in the recent past for the most part. And if you look at, this is a comparison of men and women, and if you look at the left-hand figure, you see that there's never been a very large gap in the educational attainment at the high school level of men and women, but women were a little bit behind men in the past, and now they're just a little bit ahead, but we are getting to a time when more than 90% of the people in their late 20s at least report they have a high school diploma. If you look at college education, you see something that was probably not predicted. That is, women did not complete college at the rates men did back in the 70s. By the early 90s, there was a convergence. And now we have a situation in which we've had a feminization of higher education, and women are more likely to complete college than are men. Currently, in their late 20s, we're running about 42% of women report a college education compared to about 36% for men. So women have definitely narrowed and exceeded men in college attainment. What about the situation for Blacks and whites? That's in the next chart. And again, at the high school level, it used to be the case 50 years ago that African Americans had a completion rate about 20 points below that of whites. That has pretty much disappeared. And now in the recent ACS and CPS data, among those in their late 20s, it's about 95% of whites and about 91% of African Americans report a high school education. There's been a sharp increase in college completion for both races, but not at all a convergence. And we are now at a situation where something like 3/8 of whites in their late 20s complete college, compared to about a quarter of African Americans. So there are these changes going on. And let me move on to the second topic, and that is the social and physical distance between the races. The Fair Housing Act of '68 sought to ban most, but not all, types of racial discrimination in the housing market. And the kind of physical distance that's probably most frequently measured by demographers is racial residential segregation. I have selected here those metropolitan areas that had 500,000 or more African American residents in 2019. And in the left-hand panel, you see the index of dissimilarity measuring the residential segregation of Blacks from whites using census tract data. And if you look at those numbers, you find a consistent pattern of decreasing segregation. Segregation declined in all of these metropolitan areas, and in the rapidly growing metropolises of the South and West, there was a substantial decrease. In Miami, this index went down from 82 to 64, in Dallas from 78 to 56, in Los Angeles from 81 to 66. Back in 1980, there were 97 metropolises in this nation which had indexes of dissimilarity above 70, and they were home to 75% of the nation's metropolitan Black populations. In 20 19 using Bill Fry's indexes, there's only 10 metropolises that have indexes of such a high magnitude, and they're home to only 19% of the nation's urban Black population. So there have been declines. And over in the left-hand panel, I show the Black Isolation Index, namely the percent Black in the neighborhood of the typical Black individual in those metropolitan areas. And once again, there's been a sharp decrease in Los Angeles, for instance. Now, the typical African American lives in a neighborhood where only a quarter of the residents are African Americans. In the rapidly growing southern cities such as Miami, Charlotte, and Virginia Beach, African Americans live in neighborhoods that in which their race is less than 50% of the population. So we have seen changes in this of some substantial magnitude, decreasing segregation. I think this comes about because of changes in racial attitudes. HUD has 4 times conducted surveys in which paired testers are sent out to ask about advertised housing, and they show a decline, but not a disappearance of racial discrimination on the part of brokers. The rapid growth of the Asian, Hispanic, and other race population, at least according to Jim Lewin, is reducing Black-white segregation. And finally, the improvement in the economic status of African Americans allows them to bid on a wider range of housing. We've certainly seen a suburbanization of the Black population and a decreases, but certainly not a disappearance of racial residential segregation. There's another aspect of the social distance between the races, and that's increasing interracial marriage. Richard Alba, in his new book, stresses this in considerable detail. 41 states had laws preventing Asians from marrying whites and so forth when the Loving decision was rendered by the Supreme Court in 1967, making it impossible to ban people from opposite races of marrying. And I have data here for the last 50 years. Again, young individuals who have recently married, these are people who are married, spouse present. Used to be you had to have someone of the opposite sex, but no longer, since we had a Supreme Court decision about that. But on the left-hand panel, you see the percent of young Black married men who are with a spouse of the opposite race. And opposite race, I mean the white race. So in 1970, about 3% of young Black married men had a white spouse. That's now up to about 21%. And among women, there has been a rise in the percent of young Black married women who have a white spouse. There's been a similar increase among whites at roughly the same rate, but as you might expect, the proportion of Blacks who marry whites is going to be higher than the proportion of whites who marry Blacks because of the difference in the size of those two populations. So there is definitely an increase in interracial marriage, at least as measured by the Census Bureau's data. The next figure is one that reflects the change that occurred in 2000 as interracial marriages occurred and we became more flexible. And for the first time in 2000, every individual could identify with as many races as they want. And this shows the percentage of Blacks who also identified as whites and the percentage of whites who also identified as Blacks. And as you can see, there's a substantial increase. The proportion of Blacks who identified as whites has gone up from about 2.5% to 8%, and the proportion of whites who also identify as Black has gone up from about 0.5% to about 1.5%. There's a forthcoming book by Rachel Butts in which she argues that this is a very powerful indicator of the declining social distance between the two races. My final data concern the Voting Rights Act and people voting. And here I have in figure 12 over on the left-hand chart, I show the percent of citizens voting in a presidential election years. This comes from the Census Bureau's CPS survey that's conducted in presidential years since 1978. There's been some convergence. And in 2012, for the first time, the turnout of African Americans in a presidential election year was at a higher rate than the turnout of whites. And in the right-hand chart, I show similar information for the off-year election. And you may be able to see some convergence there, but the turnout in off-year elections is much lower than in presidential election years. Perhaps more convincing of a trend, a change in since the Voting Rights Act, is the fact that more African Americans and more women are being elected to Congress. This shows the number of Blacks and women serving in Congress from the early 70s through the current time. And you can see the number of women serving in Congress has gone up to 141. There were only 5 women serving in Congress when the Civil Rights Acts were passed back in the 1960s. And this is the only chart I show that has anything that looks like possible equity. African Americans make up about 13% of the citizen voting age population in the United States. And with the election of Raphael Warnock last month, the month before last, to Congress, we have now 59 African Americans serving in Congress. So they make up about 11% of the congressional composition. So that's the story. There are a lot of things I didn't talk about here, the effects of massive changes in employment, the effects of Thomas Piketty's view of modern capitalism, which gives most rewards to those at the upper rather than the lower end of the distribution. I didn't talk about the incarceration of African Americans, nor did I talk about the issue of norms of diversity. We do have this norm of diversity. We now have women running athletic teams. We had a woman officiating at this year's Super Bowl and a woman on the sidelines coaching last year. There is a norm of diversity, and that may be propelling some of the kinds of changes. I have in my written remarks some comments about policy issues. I don't have much time to get into them, but it does seem to me that in the Nixon and the Johnson, the Nixon and the Ford administration, there was a much stronger dedication to fighting poverty and to improving the lot of those toward the bottom. We had President Carter, who was a real strong deficit hawk, and then we elected President Reagan, who saw and announced that his predecessors had fought a war on poverty, and they lost that war on poverty. And by golly, he did draw back on many of the efforts that had been made to fight poverty. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk again after 33 years.
Ren, thank you very, very much. That was terrific. And to ask you some questions in a discussion format here, we're very fortunate to have with us Ryan Cho, who is a PhD student in sociology at UCLA. He holds an MA in sociology from UCLA and a bachelor's degree in political science from Columbia University. Ryan, over to you.
Great, thanks, John. Again, thank you, Professor Farley, for the presentation, and of course your work in informing, I guess what I can safely say now is a generation of demographers on these patterns and trends. I think this update is especially timely given what I believe is a broader interest in recent years among both academics and I think the general populace in the inequality that exists between whites and Blacks, as well as men and women in the United States. I think what struck me during the presentation is that in some contexts, such as income inequality, so much and so little has changed at the same time, which is what your presentation notes. We could probably spend the entire duration of this panel talking about the various trends and patterns of the course of these decades. And I only wanted to reserve a single comment about the impact of incarceration, which you briefly mentioned in your conclusion. The reality, of course, is that the overall number of incarcerated individuals, especially in the United States, has increased in the past few decades. And that today, Black individuals and especially Black men face incarceration at 5 times the rate white individuals. And because of the because incarcerated individuals are often excluded from the sampling of the surveys, which you got some of the data from, like the CPS and statistics, I don't think we would be surprised to see even larger disparities than the ones you pointed out today in your presentation. But transitioning to some questions, I was curious about the decline in racial residential segregation that you point out, particularly in metropolitan areas. You note that the decline might partially be driven by changing preferences of Americans. And I guess I couldn't help but think about the impact of gentrification in these areas. I'm curious as to your thoughts on the impact of gentrification, whether you think that this is a temporary trend, and really what we're seeing is kind of a reverse white flight, I guess you could say, from the suburbs into the cities, and whether you think then that residential integration is as important of a measure in determining that space of inequality between whites and blacks.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate your comments. I think the work of Raj Chidi is pretty strong in suggesting that segregation, the kind of neighborhood you live in when you're growing up, has a lot to do with whether you're going to be upwardly mobile or downwardly mobile. But we have a lot of different aspects of this. We are seeing a suburbanization of the African-American population in many of the older cities. There was limited demand in some of those older suburban neighborhoods as the white population either reached the end of the line or moved to Florida, and middle-class African-Americans have moved in without incident. The gentrification issue, I think, plays out differently in many cities. Here in at least Michigan, we have a cap on property taxes, so people are not being forced out of their homes by gentrification. And we have seen an influx of young college graduates going to cities, and they do have more liberal ideas, and they're willing to live in neighborhoods that would not be appealing to their parents. So I think there certainly is still a lot of racial residential segregation, but it's definitely declining. And in many parts of the South and the West, the Hispanic and Asian population is growing very rapidly. And Jim Lewin argues it's pretty easy for realtors to target one group for exclusion, but you start losing your market if you exclude 3 or 4 major groups. So we will see what happens, but I think there is some progress on that. And looking at the school integration data, the proportion of African-American students who go to public schools that are overwhelmingly African-American, that is also decreasing. So there are some, I think, significant changes. But as you mentioned, on most economic indicators, everybody's a little bit better off than they were 50 years ago. But the black-white comparison, there's very little evidence of improvement, whereas women have made progress in terms of earnings. Thank you.
Ryan and Brent, thank you very, very much for that exchange. Let's move on now to our second panelist. Dr. Ann Pebley is the Fred H. Bixby Chair and Distinguished Professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences and Department of Sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is also the Director of UCLA's Bixby Center on Population and Reproductive Health. She was PAA president in 1998 when she was at the RAND Corporation just shortly before joining the faculty at UCLA. So Ann, over to you.
Thanks very much, John, and thank you to the committee and to everybody for organizing this effort. And I am sharing my screen here. Okay. All right. So uncharacteristically for my own research and also for the series, I am actually, believe it or not, not going to present tables and figures. Normally, my research is very data driven, but my presentation in 1998 And my remarks today will be much more driven by ideas and less and words and less quantitative compared to what I would normally present. So in 1998, I talked about demography, particularly the field of demography and the environment. And this is a picture from an update of a picture that I showed in my presidential address of the rainforest. This happens to be a rainforest in Cambodia and how it's changed over time. So I too, I wanted to thank Bob Hummer for his words. I too wanted to pause for a moment and honor Rob Mayer and Al Herman, who, as Bob told us, have recently passed away. They were both very important people in my own career and my own life. And I will miss them a lot. I could say a great deal more, but I think I'll just, given Bob's introduction, I'll just leave it at that. Very sad thing to lose both of them. So my talk was really on the field of demography and the environment, as I say. And why pick this topic? As Ren says, when you're elected PAA president, you start thinking, well, what would I like to talk about? And I could have chosen to talk about a lot of my own research, but I decided to pick this topic for a variety of reasons. One was in 1998, major environmental change was becoming increasingly obvious. Not as obvious as it is now, but certainly definitely becoming increasingly obvious. I'd also had a long term interest in environmental issues since I was very young, and much more of activist orientation when I was young. And that actually originally got me involved in thinking about population issues and demography in what I probably would characterize now as a pretty simplistic way, but nonetheless, it got me into the field of demography. There was also at the time, and still is to a large degree, an extensive but often simplistic discussion in the environmental literature about the effects of population growth on environmental change as a cause of environmental change. And I think I was pretty frustrated with that literature, but there was, because of the literature, a lot of pressure on the demographic community to talk about, in fact, the role of population growth in causing environmental change. And I should say that another factor, which is not on my list, but in 1997, the Kyoto protocols were signed, which was also drawing a lot of attention to environmental issues. There was a very well-known and also controversial report issued by the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Population 2 years beforehand, called Population Growth and Economic Development Policy Questions. And this report, among other things, focused on the concern that population growth would dampen or suppress economic development, and by implication, potentially not be a major drain on natural resources that were required for economic development. And in the environmental community, this was taken as a very worrisome conclusion. I think it was interpreted in probably a much more simplistic way than it should have been. I don't think that was the intention of the committee, but it led to a lot of concern about demographers thinking that population growth was not involved in environmental change. There was also limited empirical work on the environment in the field of demography. And it was also the 200th anniversary of Malthus's first essay, in which he talked, as we all know, about the effect of population growth on resource availability. And in particular, he was thinking about land availability. I should say he also subsequently revised in later versions of the essay some of the more simple ideas that he espoused in that first version, but in that first version and subsequent versions, he definitely raised these issues of the relationship between population and economic development and the environment. So let me give a brief summary of my presidential address. I asked 3 questions. The first was, why haven't environmental issues been more central in demographic research at that time? Second was, what areas of environmental change have demographers actually studied? And the third was, are there other environmental issues on which we as demographers could make substantial contributions? So let me just review what I said. On the first question about why there had not been more of a central focus on environmental issues in demography, I was interested to see a recent article published this year that says that I did not give an answer to this question. I think it would be a little fairer to say I did not give a single answer to this question, but rather a more complex answer. And I think the reason is that the answer is more complex. I think basically I'd cite 4 reasons. And the first 2 are related to the fact that demographers drew different conclusions about the relationship between population growth or rapid population growth and natural resources, which is sort of what the discussion was very much in the beginning when demographers began to be talking about environmental issues. By inference, the discussion about natural resources really included the natural environment as well. So some demographers, certainly starting in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, agreed that rapid population growth could imperil natural resources and, by inference, make economic development more difficult, that we could run out of natural resources because of population growth. But a lot of those demographers focused on fertility decline and thinking about what are the drivers of fertility decline, rather than focusing on showing the relationship that between various aspects of various aspects of natural resource decline or environmental degradation and population growth. Other demographers argued that human societies and economies adapt, and that we've adapted many times in the past and will adapt again, and that the idea of natural resources running out was overly simplistic and really not taking into account the way that human societies work. Another reason I think that people were not involved, demographers were not involved in research in this area, was that it required a lot of outside expertise outside of demography, and often collaboration with researchers in other fields, particularly in the physical sciences and biological sciences, who weren't necessarily very sympathetic to the particular approaches that demographers would take. So, I did a little investigation of taking a look, for example, at global climate change and at greenhouse gas production, and how we might study those issues, and talk to people at NOAA and NASA about data that were available and how we could use some of the satellite imagery. And it was clear that the sort of approach that demographers might take to looking at how populations at local levels, by which I mean subnational levels, how their behavior might produce particular greenhouse gases, was not something that was of interest. And at that point, there really were not good ways or easy ways to take satellite imagery and other kinds of data and combine them with demographic data. Some people, as I will say, pioneered doing it, and now it's much easier, but at that time it was much more difficult. And data were difficult to obtain. data, as I'm saying, on environmental issues were difficult to obtain. Now, looking back 23 years later, I'd add, a lot of these questions were really outside our comfort zone and not at all what we saw as demographic research. I mean, most of us were trained as social scientists. Most of us were trained to think about, especially fertility issues and fertility decision making, thinking about population composition and related issues, mortality and migration, and not particularly these larger environmental issues. So, what areas of environmental change did demographers study? Well, there were basically three types of studies at that point. The first type were studies of population size or growth and composition, and their effects on greenhouse gases and pollution. And these models typically, these were models which were much closer to the models that the IPCC and others were producing, and IPCC continues to produce, that were macro decomposition models to try to assess the proportion of greenhouse gas pollution and other pollution output could be attributed to population size, growth, and composition. Second were population growth models, where models in which population growth's effect on land use and deforestation were studied. And these were primarily in lower income countries. And I've listed in each of these cases some of the demographers who were involved in these studies. And the third were studies of environmental hazards and their effect, local environmental hazards and their effects on migration choices. And these were studies typically done in higher income countries. So the third question I sought to answer were, are there other environmental issues on which demographers could make substantial progress? And the first one was that I think is actually very important, that I've actually seen relatively little research on since, but people can correct me if there is research on this issue by demographers. Research on spatial distribution of the population and its environmental consequences. And this is related to questions such as, this is not so much forest destruction and use of virgin land for human settlement, as much as questions that environmentalists and ecologists ask about concentration of population rather than dispersed settlement of population. What do we gain from concentrating populations in urban areas, which may actually, from an environmental point of view, be positive, versus a more scattered settlement of the human population? Second is changing consumption patterns. I mean, consumption is a very major, as we're all aware, a very major driver of environmental problems, various types of environmental problems. And a lot of these consumption patterns are variables that we ourselves really care about, like population aging, household formation, and social inequality. So I thought, well, these are issues that we might have a lot useful to say about. And the third was environmental change and health. And that's a fairly obvious kind of connection that even then was obvious. And these days with COVID originating, we think, in an animal population, and with Ebola and other diseases, I think it's much more obvious. So my conclusion was that demographers should engage with environmental issues because they're important. They're important, and we face them collectively. That there are multiple links between demographic processes and environmental issues, and that the limited understanding of demographic and social processes in environmental research and policy communities was really hindering making progress on these issues, and it was something that we could help remedy. But that given the data and skills required for this kind of research, plus the need to collaborate with other disciplines, it could be quite hard. So it's 23 years later, and I have some minor, I think, not minor, but some regrets, and some feelings that have not been changed. One regret is that I talked about studies that looked at the racial and ethnic composition of the location of hazardous waste sites. And I only looked at a couple of studies, I cited them, and they were studies that showed that at least at a national level, you couldn't see major differences in the racial and ethnic composition of locations where there were or were not hazardous waste sites. Now that I've looked at that literature in a lot more detail, it's quite clear that hazardous waste sites are much more likely to be located in uh, communities that are poor or that have a higher proportion of people of color. So that was just an error on my part. I also, at that point, did not adequately consider social inequality and its consequences, both for population change and for environmental change. And I think going forward, it's a very, very important component of what we need to be doing. One thing that hasn't changed is that I still believe that demographic research on the causes, consequences, and ways to reduce and manage environmental change is very much needed and important. So, okay, what's happened since 1998? Well, there's a sizable but still limited body of research on demographic research on environmental issues, much more substantial than there was. There are sessions at virtually all PAA meetings on population and the environment on various topics. And the environment, of course, just like population, is not some single unified topic. There are many, many aspects to it, and demographers are tackling a number of aspects. There's also an increased quantity and quality of research published in journals on demographic aspects of environmental issues by demographers. And I also wanted to highlight an article, or a very brief article by Hunter and Mencken. I've given you the citation, that essentially updates a lot of the thinking that I was doing in my presidential address. Well, I wish I could claim credit for all of this new research, and focus on environmental issues. But I don't think I can. A few other things were happening too during the same period. Climate and other environmental changes and their consequences have become more and more obvious, I think more obvious to the general public, but especially to people like us who are in the research community. So I think it's very natural that we should think more about these issues and their consequences. There's much better and more accessible spatially referenced data on environmental variables. And I cite the example of IPUMS, DHS, the Demographic and Health Surveys, which have spatially referenced environmental variables now connected up with DHS surveys that are quite easy to use. And that's certainly not the end of it. I mean, there are many, many people who work in this area can tell you there are many, many, many well constructed and carefully thought out data sets that look at virtually everything that you would want to know, often spatially referenced. Also, a number of demographic pioneers have blazed methodological and theoretical trails for others interested in this area. And there are a number of people, and I haven't mentioned them all, but in particular, I'm thinking about Deborah Balk, Barbara Entwistle and her colleagues, Bill Axon and his colleagues, and Laurie Hunter. And on environmental disasters, which we think are going to increase because of the consequences of climate change, Elizabeth Frankenberg and her colleagues, and Narayan Sastry and his. So if you are interested in this area and you want to get your feet on the ground and figure out what makes sense and how to proceed, you might have a look at some of their work. I'd also say on the other side, some environmental researchers now take a much more nuanced and realistic approach to social and demographic processes and the way that societies work. And that's quite refreshing and makes collaboration much easier.
Oh, and truthfully, not to be environmentally insensitive, but we're kind of out of
Okay, I'll leave my final thoughts.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Terrific. Thank you very, very much. And I apologize for having to.
Oh, no, I apologize. I thought it was on time, so no problem.
Okay, and now we have the pleasure of having with us Maria Vignao-Loria, a PhD student in sociology at the University of Washington. She holds a master's degree in sociology from the University of Washington and an undergraduate degree in sociology from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, UNAM, as it is abbreviated. So, Maria, would you like to comment on Dr. Pebley's talk?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Anne, and also thank you to the History Committee for the opportunity on commenting on Dr. Pebley's presidential address. This address was given 23 years ago, and yet the issues it discusses are incredibly timely and relevant. I found this work to be an invitation to take the study of the interaction between human population dynamics and environmental phenomena seriously, moving beyond these monocausal explanations in which environmental change is a function of population size and population growth. I think Dr. Pebley asks us to think about both the effect of demographic change and demographic dynamics on environmental outcomes, such as, for example, socioeconomic and demographic determinants of pollution, and in turn to think about the effect of environmental change on demographic dynamics, particularly health and mortality, for example, but also migration and displacement. So Dr. Pebley mentioned how up until then, environmental issues had been in the periphery of the main areas of demographic research, and she ends her address asking how or whether environmental issues would have a more central place in demographic research in the future. And her answer was yes, and time proved her right. As she mentioned, in the last 23 years, demographers have produced more research and research of better quality on the demographic aspects of environmental issues. And there are still some areas, though, where the complexity of some of these issues have complicated the progress and the evolution of this subfield. And this leads me to very broad questions. The first one is related to inequalities and inequities, which Dr. Pebley, you mentioned. Many environmental problems are not attributable to local demographic dynamics, but to national, international markets that drive demand for products, as well as historical structural relationships where the environmental costs are paid by the most vulnerable. And we can think about this on the global scale, like thinking about globalization of production, and also subnationally. I think you mentioned the unequal distribution of environmental hazards within the US, for example. But knowing that the environmental costs and benefits are not distributed equally across and within societies, how can we, as demographers, think about these historical, structural, economic relationships and include links between macro and micro scale processes in our analysis and our studies? So that's the first question. And a second question, maybe broader still, you alluded to already. It asks about our specific role as demographers in this interdisciplinary conversation. You mentioned, and I'll quote you because I really like your description, that on the whole, demographers are a pragmatic and skeptical group who like empirical evidence and disdain dramatic rhetoric. You said this in your address, I really liked it. And so if we are indeed reflective about data quality, measurements, methods, and empirical evidence to draw conclusions, what is our role and place in these debates? And where do our contributions lie in a conversation that has been increasingly politicized and placed under public scrutiny?
I would say great questions, Maria. Thanks so much. And let me see if I can be brief. So in the first question, absolutely. I mean, you know, I on my last slide, I put up a cartoon which had a bunch of cows on one side and a bunch of cows on the other side. And the cows on one side were fat and happy and lying in grass, and the cows on the other side were skinny and had only dirt to sit on. And the cows that were fat and happy said, if you want Western standards of living, you've got to stop emitting so much pollution. So if you want to come over here, stop emitting so much pollution. But the truth is the 2 cows who were fat and happy were actually emitting more pollution. So I completely agree with you. It's very tough to think about how you model these things, but I think the crucial thing is research is not, a single study. Research is something that you build from multiple ways of looking at a problem. And I think there's lots of room for macro research and subnational research as well, but also local area research. The thing is, a lot of the research so far has been focused on more local areas to try to nail things down and get a handle on them. And I think it's really important to link that with bigger scale research because, as you say, a lot of the inequalities are between countries, between regions, and regions within countries. I mean, they're not as much among individual people, though that's true too. And we need to incorporate those kinds of inequalities and power dynamics. And that pushes us, into areas we don't always talk about, but I think are really, really important. On the question of our role and place in the particularly politically heated discussions, let me just say briefly, I am a great believer in empirical research. And I think empirical research, one of the things we can do is be, as we often usually are, clear-eyed and thoughtful, and produce empirical research which provides a very solid basis to know what is the reality on the ground. Sometimes, rhetoric it wins the day in the short run, but I am a believer that in the long run, solid evidence does have a major effect. So maybe I'm too optimistic, but that's what I'd say.
Okay, Anne and Maria, thank you very, very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce the third of our 3 past presidents, Dr. Charles Herman, who is Boeing International Professor Emeritus in the Department of Sociology at the University of Washington. He's also the former director of the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology there at UW, as well as past chair of the Sociology Department. He was PAA president in 2005. So Charlie, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, and the History Committee for inviting me to present today. It's also a great honor to share the stage with Ann Pedley and Ren Farley. Okay, so let me see if I can get my slides up here. Okay, the title of my address was a play on words. The 20th century was often referred to as the American century, primarily because of the ascendance of American economic, political, and military power during this time period. And I was trying to make the case that American society has another legacy, and I think in the long term, even more important, that we accepted, not always happily, but we did, tens of millions of migrants from around the world who not only came to the United States and made their way here, but also changed the structure of American society. And in my address, rather than to go deeply, I went sort of skated over a number of areas, and I talked about how immigration has sort of made America, and I had 5 topics: population, cities, economy, politics, and culture. And there's a lot to get into these things, but I'm just going to give a few brief comments on any one of them, all of them, to try to stay within my time today. In terms of the demographic forces, the immigration has clearly changed the country. We think of a country as sort of a population as being the descendants of some ancestral population. At the time of America's founding, we were a very small country. At the present time, we have 330 million people, give or take a few million at the present time. And most of those people claim to be descendants of a founding population. But in reality, they are not. They are the descendants of people who came in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, rather than an original founding population. Another trait of the effect of immigration is on changing the makeup of the country. We admit migrants from around the world, and since the 1965 immigration law, a number of immigrants have arrived from new sources of migration from Asia and from Latin America. And one of the fears of many Americans is that the United States is becoming a majority-minority country, that somehow whites are going to lose their demographic and perhaps privileged position. And this is a subject of more attention than I wish that were. And I've tried to push back a little bit on this theme myself. And Ren mentioned Richard Alba's fine book, The Great Demographic Illusion, is, I think, a definitive statement on this topic. And essentially, there's a flaw in this argument that sort of misses what has happened over time. That is to say that the United States has always been diverse. There's never been a point in which we were sort of all defined as one community itself. And what is kind of remarkable is that over the American history, outsiders have become insiders. And so the group that's fearful of living in this privileged place, their grandparents, a few generations back, were the outsiders in this whole thing. So that's the effect on population, briefly as I can put it here. Cities are where things happen. This is a place of social change, of innovation. This is why cities are both exciting and dangerous at the same time. But the legacy of American society is largely formed in cities. Political ideals, I claim the Industrial Revolution took place because of the concentration of industrial production in cities. And all of these changes occurred in places where immigrants and their children, I'm including their children as part of the immigrant community, were usually the majority of the population. This is true in the 19th century, is true in the early decades of the 20th century. In my 2005 address, I tried to point out that recent migration to the big industrial cities in the Northeast and the Midwest were helping to maintain the demographic and economic viability of these cities. At the present time, in the early 21st century, with approaching zero population growth, incipient decline, aging, slowdown in domestic migration, migration still remains strong, and it's providing both a demographic ballast and also economic entrepreneurial activities and so on, not only in cities, but also increasingly in suburbs and even rural areas that have become new destination areas. Okay, third topic here, the economy. In my 2005 address, I relied very heavily upon a National Academy of Sciences report called The New Americans. And this report challenged the prevailing logic at the time that immigrants represented a threat to American workers, American jobs, American wages, and also was a potential risk to American the fiscal system. They were going to consume more resources than they were going to pay in terms of taxes, and this would be a drain on local and the federal government. The empirical research by the National Academy of Science report sort of exploded all of those things. To be sure, some immigrants do take jobs away from Americans, but they also create new jobs, and the net contribution was basically close to zero. In terms of the fiscal system, there was a cost to educating new immigrants, though that could regard as an investment in the future. But if you take a long-term historical perspective, intergenerational, immigrants are actually made a positive contribution to the American fiscal system. Now, in 2021, I can draw upon another National Academy of Sciences report that was released in 2017. And quite unsurprisingly to me, but I think maybe a surprise to many Americans, basically reinforced all the findings of the 1997 report and added new reasons why immigration was good for the American economic system. Not only did they not harm or take away jobs or wages from American workers and not drain the fiscal system, but immigrants were also contributing to economic growth in the country, particularly through migration of highly skilled workers. The 2017 report that came out was issued just about the time that the new Trump administration was taking place. And the summary of the 2017 report in the New York Times had the title, "How to Make America Greater, More Immigration." In other words, we have a learned scientific study that says if we want to really achieve the goals of the current administration, we don't want to stop immigration, we want to bring more immigrants here. Another theme of the 2017 report was realized in an editorial in Science magazine. This is the leading scientific publication of the world, issued by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And the editor writes here, immigrants help to make America great. Silicon Valley, scientific laboratories, American universities, across the board, American progress, technological progress, and medical achievements and so on are increasingly contributed to by immigrants and the children of immigrants who are coming to the country. I could go on and on about this topic, but I want to move on to the topics that may be slightly different from what you might have heard before. Immigrants are not political beings. They tend to look inward rather than outward. But at certain moments in American history, immigrants and their children, who are all naturalized and eligible to vote, have played a critical role in certain elections that I think that have led to eras of American history that have helped to address major social ills. In the 1930s, this was the depth of the Great Depression. In the 1960s, it was the legacy of Jim Crow that was still part of the reinforced by public authorities at that time. These were issues that Wren talked about in his address. And in the election leading up to the 1932 Roosevelt coalition, the 1928 election of Al Smith essentially transformed the Democratic Party into the party of immigrants in big cities. Similarly, in the 1964 election, it was a massive election that Johnson won with almost 60% of the vote. Everybody contributed to that victory. But in 1960, it was a nail biter. It was very, very close. And I think the edge, well, there are many edges to any victory, but in 1960, a fifth of the electorate were the second generation, were the children of immigrants. They were predominantly Catholic and Jewish, and they probably provided the margin a vote for John Kennedy, and I think this helped to set the stage for the Johnson Great Society program that passed a whole series of reform legislation that at least began the process of sort of addressing civil rights issues, also areas of social, of Medicare, federal aid to education, new immigration reform as well. And so now it's 2021, I can add another to this list, though I'm sort of going out on a bit of a limb here. I think we faced another major challenge in this last election, and this is the response to the new American nativism, essentially pinning all of the ills of the country on xenophobia, fear of people who were different than us. Not only immigrants, but also other minority groups as well. And this is kind of turned, realigned a lot of the American electorate along education, gender cohort, region, a whole series of other communities that have been aligned differently in previous years. And in 2020, we actually sort of narrowly, but nonetheless significantly rejected this strand of American political thought. And I would argue that not only was nativism one of the important parts of Trump's appeal, but it was also one of the major reasons why he lost in 2020. Now, here's a little bit of data, first data that you've seen in my talk. And this is from a Pew Research Center report. On the left-hand side are three columns of the changes in the eligible electorate of voters from 2000 to 2018. And I'm using ethnicity here as a proxy for the immigration community, but if you can look from bottom up from 2000 to 2018, you can see, which you probably already know, that the Hispanic community increased its proportion of the electorate from 7 to 13%. Asians doubled from 2% to 4%. Still minorities, but in a close election, the changing composition of the electorate matters. It changes not only because of the composition of the population, but whom they vote for. One of the reasons why the Hispanic and Asian communities were very important in the recent election is that the other two communities, the white and black populations, are fairly stable in terms of their political preferences. whites are about 10 percentage points more likely to vote for the Republicans than are Democrats. These are registered voters who identify as or lean towards one party or another based upon a series of Pew polls from 1994 to 2018-19. The African-American community is predominantly supportive of the Democratic Party, and this really has not changed. But you can see the Hispanic community has edged up a little bit in terms of its Democratic leanings. The Asian community much more so, and I think that this is a response to recent political events. And the combination of the increasing share of the electorate and their partisanship over time has played a very critical role in the 2020 election as it had been before in the 1960s and 1930s. Culture, a big topic, not typically one in which demographers know very much about. Nonetheless, I will kind of venture forth and say that there is something about American culture that's different than many other countries, at least relatively, if not absolutely. And it has something to do with the fact that Americans in general, or people who come from elsewhere in the world to the United States, have a feeling that things are possible here that are not elsewhere. There's something in the air, less of the weight of custom and tradition that makes it possible for people to do things differently, whether it's economically or politically or in some other form. And as I took in my 2005 address an empirical indicator of this, the fact that a lot of American culture is defined by Hollywood movies, that a lot of the creativity came from abroad. And I put this was actually a chart from my 2005 address. And this was a list of film directors who had won multiple Academy Awards for directing. You recognize some of these names: Frank Capra, Billy Wilder, William Wyler. Maybe I recognize them, people of my age, vintage. But anyhow, it was kind of shocking to me, and I think maybe to many others, to realize that the first and second generation origins of these movie directors was kind of remarkable. Strangers shouldn't know what should appeal to American audience. Directors play a very formative role in sort of shaping how actors and actresses play their parts, but the outsiders seem to have done more than you might imagine. Well, was that just a one-time phenomena? Well, I don't know, but I did turn to my favorite demographic source of knowledge, Wikipedia, and I looked at the directors who have won Academy Awards from 2010 to 2019, the most recent 10 periods. And on the last-hand column, you can see the place of origin as given by Wikipedia. Sometimes it's a place, sometimes it's a country, but you can see that Mexico is kind of sweeping the land here. We have 5 American Academy Awards for directing from people from Mexico. Europe and Asia also make a register here, and we have 1 American-born director in 2016. Now, this is not immigrants to American society. This is globalization. Many of these directors still reside in their country of origin, but they're releasing their movies through Hollywood, and I think a lot of the cultural content of these movies, at least is interpreted by Americans and the rest of the world, as something distinctively American. Now, in this slide, I try to do 2 things in probably it's impossible to do. In the left-hand column, I'm going to say, why did this happen? How was it possible that outsiders helped to define what America is? And in the right-hand column, I try to say, why is this important? Why were they able to do it? I offer 3 arguments here. One is that they were blocked from other careers. If you want to go to medical school, law school, if you're very bright and talented, many of these careers are blocked because you don't have the connections and the resources to do it. But if you're very talented, you turn to something called high-risk, high-reward fields, fields that are more open to talent than many other areas that depend upon connections and money. This would include the creative arts, science, sports, crime. I'll throw that in here as well. And so this is an area in which outsiders, if they are extraordinarily capable, might rise to the top that they could not maybe do elsewhere. Secondly, selectivity. Immigrants are different. They're not representative of the countries from which they come. If there's one attribute that one might think about them, they are strivers. They don't give up. When they hit the wall or the wall stops them, they find a way to go around it, over it, through it, if necessary, to be able to do so. Thirdly, marginality. In other words, if you know multiple cultures, you know multiple languages, you kind of wonder why things the way they are, and you might think about innovation in ways that insiders may not. And so I developed this more in my published version of my address and also a 2013 paper, but I think this gives a reason why it's at least plausible that outsiders can create American culture. Why is this important? Well, surprise is part of it, but I think it also indicates something about American society. This was taken as a theme of a 2015 American National Academy of Sciences report that talked about the integration of immigrants into American society. You might think that integration is just another word for assimilation, but it was used very consciously to indicate that this is something different from outsiders becoming insiders. This is two groups becoming closer together. Immigrants do adapt and help to participate in American society, but American society also changed as a result of their presence. In an interview with the New York Times, Mary Waters, who was the chair of the committee, says, however America does this, brings in outsiders, makes them Americans, has American society change itself as a response to this, we're very good at that. And I think that I certainly agree with that. In this 2013 article on Daedalus, I tried to sort of go deeper into this, and I tried to take a whole range of other performing arts fields to show how immigrants have made a disproportionate influence in it. And basically, I argue that immigrants have influenced a lot of American society, much more than we think of. Sometimes we just take them for granted, the Statue of Liberty, Hollywood, ideology, and so on. I also argue that they've helped to shape American institutions to be more competitive and meritocratic. It isn't that American institutions are comparative or meritocratic, but they are perhaps maybe more so than other countries, and they have also changed in this direction over the decades as a result of having immigrants here who are knocking in the door. In other words, if you might prefer a hometowner to be playing on your baseball team, but you might actually prefer your baseball team win. And if the talents are outside, okay, we'll take the outsider into this. And I think this happens in symphony orchestra, it happens in scientific establishments, it happens in the performing arts as well. In a 2019 article in Ethnic and Racial Studies, Phil Kasnitz tries to argue on how this has changed the Broadway musical theater, and he takes as a case example the musical Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda. And this is kind of a really interesting, kind of far out kind of topic, but he's no longer trying to make American culture sort of slip in an idea from the outside, but to try to recast American history, including the founding of the American country, as an immigrant story. He has Black and brown actors playing revolutionary characters. He has them talking and singing hip hop as well. By the way, this is both a artistic and a commercial success. Everybody, including cultural conservatives, are flocking to see Hamilton. He also has Alexander Hamilton and Lafayette approaching the final battle of the Revolutionary War, saying, immigrants, we get the job done. You turn to us to have to solve problems. And Hamilton was an outsider. He was an immigrant from the Caribbean, and he actually did shape a lot of the structure in the early part of American society and polity. So this was the quotation from Oscar Hanlon that I ended my address with in 2005. And I think one of the questions from John Weeks to our presenters, would we still come to the same conclusions in 2021 as we did when we gave our address? And my answer is yes. I believe, along with Hanlon, that immigrants not only played an important part in American history, but a lot of what has happened to American society in the 19th and the early 20th and even the 21st century is shaped by the engagements of immigrants to American society. In the 18th century, the frontier was settled. The Appalachian areas were settled by the Scotch-Irish, who weren't welcome to the eastern seaboard, but they crossed the mountains and they settled there, and they're still there. During the Civil War, the Union won. But did you know of the 2 million Union soldiers that overpowered the South, a quarter of them, 500,000, were immigrants. Some of them just got off the boat in New York City and they got signed up and sent to the battle. Of course, many other soldiers, including African Americans, played a critical role in that. In the American Industrial Revolution around and the decades surrounding 1900, more than half of the workers in the manufacturing sector were immigrants or the children of immigrants. I'm arguing that Hollywood, in large part, was created by parvenus from abroad who helped to shape the financing and the artistic content of Hollywood. At the present time, we think the future of America is very much tied to Silicon Valley and high tech and research laboratories and so on, and immigrants are continuing to play a major role in the technological progress of the country. So partially as my contribution from demography and partially my plea to American society, keep the door open. Thank you.
Charlie, thank you very, very much. Appreciate that greatly. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our discussant for you, who is Nathan Hoffman, PhD student in sociology at UCLA. He holds an MA in sociology from UCLA, an MSc in social policy and social research from the University College London, and a BA in French and music from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So Nathan, over to you.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Professor Hershman, for your fascinating presentation. It's an honor to provide comments. Professor Hershman's 2005 address and update today unpack the common refrain that the United States is a nation of immigrants. Extensive literature assesses the economic and demographic impact of immigration on the US, but Professor Hershman broadens the focus, considering the extensive and positive influence that immigration has had on American cities, politics, culture, and structure. His address is optimistic and inspiring to those such as myself who share the conviction that immigration is a force for good for both immigrants and the society that receives them. Yet in 2005, when Professor Hershman delivered his address, many were not optimistic. As he recognized then, the war on terror was at its zenith, border security was ramping up, and immigrants were scrutinized with increasing suspicion. More recently, the immigrant vote may have helped ensure that Donald Trump was a one-term president, and yet anti-immigrant political currents constituted a key force behind his 2016 ascension to the White House, and they continue to motivate many voters. All of this underscores the crucial role that scholars such as Professor Hershman play in conducting rigorous immigration research and communicating the facts about immigration to the public. I'd like to ask two questions. As your talk highlights, there are many similarities between immigration today and in the age of mass migration a century ago. But large-scale undocumented immigration is a fairly recent phenomenon. What does stratification by legal status mean for the impact of immigrants and their descendants in US society today? Relatedly, could you speak more to the role of changing immigrant selectivity in shaping the contributions of immigrants to US society? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nathan. Those are both very, very good questions. The topic of the legal status of migrants was a central question that was addressed in the 2015 report on the integration of immigrants into American society. Let me back up for a second. Controlling for all the socioeconomic disadvantages of the immigrants themselves, being the child of immigrants is actually a plus. You know, immigrants don't have it easy because they come with the poor socioeconomic origins of many of their families. But controlling for that, they actually overachieve relative to their weight. However, the children of undocumented immigrants do not share in this. In other words, I think that there is a barrier that is by the undocumented status of parents and sometimes of the children themselves that is a very major obstacle. I mean, some individuals, superhuman individuals, succeed in spite of that. But this is a major impediment to the integration of the children of immigrants into American society is illegality or undocumented status and so on. It creates a very precarious household to be part of. And I think it is the major issue at the present time. It's not surprising that the DACA legislation is sort of at the forefront of the current administration agenda. Selectivity, that was your second question, right? I think that this is the central secret weapon of immigrants. It's not entirely a positive force. If you ask most of the children of immigrants what it's like growing up in a household with immigrant parents, and they will stress the negative aspects of it. You know, these are parents who cannot be pleased. You know, you come home with straight A's, you know, why not A plus? You know, you're doing this and that, you know, they're pushing you harder. And so the research of Yu Shi and others have pointed out that the children of immigrants have higher rates of depression and other kind of psychosomatic illnesses than their native-born peers do. On the other hand, this kind of pressure that parents put on ambition actually pushes these children to do better academically, occupationally, and many other ways. So like many other things, selectivity is both a plus and a minus. I'm talking about the children of immigrants, but I think this applies to immigrants themselves. There was I remember this, again, something that comes out of the past, Michael Dukakis. I don't know if you many remember him. He was the child of immigrants, of Greek immigrants, who rose to run for presidency in 1988 and almost won. And he was like super successful. The pressures of immigration on Michael Dukakis pushed him towards excellence. He had a brother whom he grew up with, for whom all the forces worked in the opposite direction. And he actually died in, I think, a bicycle accident, you know, in his 20s. And he was, you know, he was not able to respond positively to the pressures that were put on him. So I think in a way, selectivity kind of creates both positive and negative forces at the same time. It kind of draws out the extremes. So I think for a country, selectivity is good because we're getting the benefits of all of these outsiders whose many of their education and earlier lives were subsidized by the institutions of other countries, and we get them, you know, in adulthood, and they work hard, and their gift to us is their children. But the cost sometimes is borne by the families themselves and their children as well.
Charlie and Nathan, thank you very much for that interchange. And let me say that everybody who has spoken today reinforces my view of the world, which is that demography is related to everything. And I believe that. I believe science proves me right on that. And you folks have all contributed to that continuing opinion. Now I'd like to turn to Marcy and Emily and Wynn to see if we have questions from the audience that our panelists should be addressing. Who's going to be in charge of that?
I think I'm going to start, John, and thank you so much to the past presidents for really terrific and thoughtful addresses that have clearly stood the test of time, which is exciting to see, and thanks for the responses. The first question we have comes from Daniel Goodkind. He asked the same question last time, which is great. We were hoping it would come up again. Basically saying, to all three of you past presidents, can you tell us about an achievement and or a publication from your career about which you are most proud? Something over the career in any respect that you'd like to talk about would be great. Maybe we'll take it in order, starting with Ren.
Thank you very much. I think the thing that is proudest about my career was getting elected to be president of the Population Association of America. I've got other things I'm proud about, but in terms of presidential achievements, in terms of academic kinds of achievements, that was the thing that was key as far as I'm concerned. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And Anne.
Well, I mean, I agree with Ren. But if we're talking about research, aside from the president of PAA role, it's a very tough question to answer. I think of research as the kind of research I'm proud of tends to come in multiple publications, not in a single publication. So I've been a kind of intentionally nomadic demographer throughout my life, and worked in a variety of areas, which is something that suits me and not everybody else. But I would say I am very proud of my work in Guatemala and Latin America on maternal and child health, my work in Los Angeles with the Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Survey on urbanization and social context and its consequences, and also my work on Latino health in the US, which I'm currently more involved with. But, I have a bunch of other things, so it's hard to choose.
Great, thanks so much. And Charlie.
Well, I think as Anne said earlier that she was an empirical researcher, though, in her address today, and her presidential address branched out to other areas. And I think that also happened to me somewhere along the way. I think I learned to be an empirical researcher from my mentors, and hearing Ren today, that's what I learned. I learned that you take the census and surveys and line up your data and see where they go. But I learned along the way that sometimes data comes from unusual sources. And I think this was sort of mid-career. I was working with ethnic composition as an independent variable, looking at the number of censuses in Malaysia. And I couldn't fit all the different groups into the categories because they kept changing. Groups were moving in and out of the major categories over time. And I realized that the ethnic categories themselves were data. How they classified in Malaysia, Malays, Chinese, and Indians, particularly during the colonial period, you could sort of look at racial ideology from the colonial period and see how the categories were listed as emblematic of what was going on. There was actually a demographer of an earlier generation, Richard Peterson, had done this in Hawaii. He had looked at the way in which census categories in Hawaii were there and how it represented sort of the social hierarchy of Hawaiian society. And so I applied this to Malaysia, and kind of in a strange way, I found that this kind of article got me more attention than some of my careful empirical analyses had over the years. And so I've kind of branched out and realized that I don't have to get all my numbers to agree to the single most percentage point. I can talk about other things. I've written about ethnic categories in American society. I've written about Hollywood, and I feel more liberated over time, and still carrying my demographic credentials. Still can construct life tables, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I guess that's what I've been pleased about in my career.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Charlie. I'm going to turn it over to Wynn and then Emily. And if others have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A box. So Wynn.
Marcy, thanks. Thanks so much to all the panelists. This has been terrific. I'd like to continue the thread that Charlie and I think all the panelists have brought up, and that's just the changing culture from decades back as it's seen through data, as it's seen through the very creative data. And I wonder how that's translated to the way you were teaching when you first started teaching, classroom teaching. Who were the students? How did you teach? What was your language back then? How has that changed to the most recent times when you were in the classroom teaching? I wonder, the extent to which sort of pedagogy and just the culture of the classroom has changed, and what's the extent to which that's a reflection of all the cultural and sort of data changes that each of you has talked about. And in this case, I'll start with Charlie, because Charlie, in my view, got me into this field way back in the 1980s. Charlie, when you taught your amazing demography class, which I was part of. So Charlie, over to you. Thank you.
Demography has a way of making you stay alive. You can't teach the same course from year to year because we're kind of tied to data, and the world changes, and this is reflected in your data. So you have to keep updating your materials, even if you're just covering your basic course on fertility, mortality, and migration. You've got to stay in touch with the literature. The other thing is that the world changes. Family planning programs come into existence. Family planning programs go out of favor. And so all the things in the world are changing as well. There's something else I think it's sort of solidified my identity as a demographer, is that I learn lots of ways of thinking about data and method through traditional demography. Learning how to think about rates and probabilities and cause and effect, and standardization is another highfalutin way of thinking about multivariate analysis, but knowing how it works with 2 variables makes it much easier to explain when you got 3 or 4 variables. So it sort of keeps me honest in some way, and I can take most of any idea that I've had, I've taken from somebody else. I didn't invent things. I just kind of borrowed methods and ideas from one field and applied them to another topic. So I think the moving back and forth between demography and broader kinds of issues comes more easily to demographers because we have to be nimble. We have to sort of change with the times because the world does change, and we have this rigorous models that we can apply to a broader range of phenomena than the traditional areas of demography.
Thank you, Charlie. I will go next to Ann Pebley. Over to you. Same question.
Okay, I guess I would say, I completely agree with what Charlie says. I would say, obviously, there's been a huge technological change. I still am fearful that I may have some transparencies sitting in some drawer. And before that, I also wrote on the board with chalk. I haven't done that in a very long time, although occasionally I'll write on a whiteboard with markers, but things have changed technologically in a huge way, which is actually terrific. It's made things much, much better. I also think I've always been a fan of, to the extent you can do it, much more dialogue in the classroom. And I've come to believe that's much more important over time. That student involvement is really crucial to learning, and that lecturing is boring both to the lecturer and to the students. But I would also say that I've certainly changed the way I think about demographic issues and the world in general hugely over this period. I think about different kinds of things. I think a whole lot more about social inequality. I certainly thought about it in the past, but I think a lot more about it now, and the distributional consequences of whatever it is I'm talking about. And I don't know, I probably have 10 more things on my list, but I'll let Ren talk. He probably has some better ideas than I.
Thank you, Ann. Ren, over to you.
Let me take a different kind of approach. I'm thinking about my own teaching here at the University of Michigan, and I see this polarization between the upper end and the bottom end of the income distribution. When I started teaching at Michigan in 1967, the university's tuition for 2 semesters was about $260. And if you take into account all their charges and adjust for inflation, a student could attend Michigan for not much over $3,000 a year. And I can recall at that time, the male students, the undergrads, many of them would work in the auto plants as working assembling cars during the summer, since they hired summer employees. And the young women would work in the Kmarts or the equivalent. If you go to the University of Michigan brochure now for first-year students coming in from the state of Michigan, university tells their parents they should expect to pay $31,000 as an in-state student at Michigan for room, board, and tuition. Now, there are subsidies and so forth, but it really is a change. We are much more selective here at Michigan. We have seen the sons and daughters of auto workers are very much less common here. That's a big, big change. The students are very talented. At one time, the Michigan enrollment, undergraduate enrollment, got all the way up to 8% African American. It's since fallen back to about 5%. But I think the leading universities are very much like large corporations, and they want to maximize their income. And because of increasing income inequality, there are lots of parents that can afford to pay very large sums of money. Michigan undergraduates now, 50% of them come from outside the state. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, but it does help to contribute to persistent income inequality. As I say, the students are very talented and very hardworking, and we have more female students than we used to. When I came, the university had a regulation that 55% of the undergrads had to be male. Well, that disappeared. That's a good change. But there really are pervasive effects of the change in the income distribution. Thank you, Wynn, for asking the question.
Wynn, I just have to say, I can't emphasize enough the importance of what Ren says, that, I mean, I would say it shows up with our students much more in terms of coming out of school with huge debts. But I think if you know, it's not unique to me, but if you think of the biggest problem for education, higher education, that's absolutely it.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your answers. Emily, I think over to you for the next questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I also have a question for everyone, and this stems from John's comment that demography is about everything. So my question to all of our past presidents is, where is kind of the most exciting, interesting, or surprising area of research in demography that you have seen recently, and or where do you think demography research is going to go in the near to midterm future? And to mix things up a little bit, we can start with Anne.
Well, you heard a little bit about some of what I think in my talk today. I mean, I actually think we vastly, you know, that we're not doing even one very small portion of what we need to be doing. But also there's, I mean, the environmental issues are extremely worrisome, but there are also huge research opportunities there to take all of our skills and use them in a different venue. And I think that will become clearer and clearer to people. And there's a lot of creativity necessary there. But, you know, we're a pretty creative group. And so that's top of my list. I would also say a big issue that we collectively have to face is how we deal with big data. We're all data junkies, and that's great. But we also believe in really good quality data. And for the most part, we believe in data that are representative and we can make inferences from to larger populations. And there's some real problems with big data and thinking about when we can do that, what it means. And I think we need to tackle those challenges head on. So I've got a very long list, but let me leave it at those two.
Thanks, Anne. And can we go to Charlie next?
When I came into the field, the one area of research that didn't change from year to year, either in findings or style of research, was mortality. You know, you could check in every 5 or 10 years and it's basically the same. The last 20 years, everything's kind of been upset. I could go on, but maybe just a couple of things. Life expectancy is declining in the United States. COVID in particular, but it's been going on for several years with the deaths of despair. Of middle and higher income people, longevity continues to increase. For lower people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, whites primarily, in depressed areas of the country with the last hope, mortality is increasing. And we have that on one hand. And then I just accidentally bumped into an article by John Vopel and some of his colleagues, just published in the National Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, predicting that most of the people who are born at the present time are going to live to be 100 or more. You know, we used to think that there was a cap on mortality. You know, about 70 or so, we're supposed to check out. You know, I mean, if you didn't die of one disease, you were going to die of another. Your warranty period was up. But the kind of research now, I mean, Bob Hummer, our presidential president, is going to speak about this this coming year. But all of what we've known about the limits on longevity, maybe they're not as true as we thought we were. And so I guess my point is that here's the oldest area of demography, and both the fact that progress is going to continue, you know, particularly for the younger and the middle-aged years, but not at the older ages, that's no longer true. And that mortality is actually widening because of greater inequality in American society, and maybe around the world as well.
I think the next area that's going to get a lot of attention in demography is slow population growth and low fertility rates. I see that partially because I'm in Michigan, where the population has been sort of stagnant since 1970. But there are increasing reports that, you know, China is going to face slow economic growth because of slow population growth. And in an economically developed economy, population growth is a stimulus for economic growth. We have city after city here in Michigan that has immense pension problems because they no longer have very many workers contributing to the pension programs, which that's the result partially of population decline. When I first started teaching at Duke, I had a colleague, Joe Spengler, who wrote a famous book, France Faces Depopulation. The French and other countries around the world in the 1930s realized they had very low fertility rates. And sometimes it was xenophobia, other times it was economic reasons, but the French adopted them and continue to the present very generous child benefits. And when Senator Romney proposed that we have a program that would distribute substantial amounts of money to every parent for every child they had, I immediately thought, is this a pro-fertility program? I mean, our total fertility rate now is about 1.6. Do we want to see a United States that goes down? Here in Michigan, we have 13 state colleges and universities. The number of children at age 0 is about 30% smaller than the number at age 18 right now. Can the state continue to support? We know that enrollment is likely to go down unless we open our borders and let everybody come in. So I think this issue of stagnant population is going to be something demographers will think about and be asked to come up with solutions.
Thank you, Ren. This is Bob Hummer again. John asked me if I'd wind things up for the day, and I'm sad in one way to do that. This is so much fun. You know, it'd be wonderful to take, just ask questions and hear from Anne and Ren and Charlie and for a long time. So, but it's time for us to go. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts with us today. It was just fun, just absolutely fun to do this. John, thank you for the organization, the History Committee. This is just a wonderful set of events. For Nathan, Maria, Ryan, thank you for your contributions, for asking great questions. Field's in your hands, and I hope you take something away from this. I really appreciate everyone signing on today, everybody who hung on for the whole time or part of the time. Keep in mind, please, PA is going to be May 5 to 8. We'll do a lot more of this kind of thing over those 4 days. So I hope you register, come to those meetings, and participate via something like Zoom. This won't be the same as in person, but we'll try. So anyway, thank you all. Hope you have a great weekend ahead. Again, a wonderful time today, and thank you all, and see you May 5th for PA. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.